Vitalik, actually, like 3 days ago, we talked to someone who's working on approval voting. They've had a lot of traction. They've gotten a lot of success in implementing approval voting in South Dakota. They're working on Seattle, Washington now. They raised a lot of money from open philanthropy, and it's been going really well. I'm curious. You're interested in quadratic voting, a lot of these other interesting systems. Can you contrast quadratic voting with approval voting? And is there, in some sense, like I guess a trade-off? And Lars, you might have a better phrasing than I do for this, between like a system that's like more optimal but is harder to explain and kind of illegible to people, to one that's like easy to explain and somewhat easier to implement.
Right. So I guess the general like theory of why existing voting is broken like starts with the Arrow's theorem, all right, where you basically there's like this list of fairly simple and like very intuitive properties that a voting system that's sane should obviously have, and it turns out that it's mathematically impossible to create one if there's more than two candidates, and so like that's why we have issues like the whole strategic voting thing, where if there might be a lot of people that like one particular candidate, but if there's this kind of self-reinforcing impression that that candidate has no chance, then everyone votes for just the lesser of two evils out of the two that do have a chance. I guess so. Approval voting is one way of getting around Arrow's theorem, right? I do think Arrow's theorem is overrated by a lot of people. Like Arrow's theorem basically, it often gets cited as this kind of general theory why politics sucks and why it has to suck. And like the reason why that's not true is because Arrow's theorem is like specifically reliant on this concept of ordinal preferences, right? That like it assumes that the thing that you are inputting is is A better than B, is A better than C, is B better than C, without being able to say by how much is A better than B, or which ones do I just think are fine and which ones do I think are not fine. I actually have my own candidate for kind of the mathematical theorem that is the general reason why politics sucks, which is I talk about this in one of my blog posts on coordination. It's basically the fact that in the individual choice model, so where games are like in game theory, where everyone's making decisions separately, you can have games that have equilibria. But in the cooperative game theory setting, so where you assume that kind of subsets of players can actually talk to each other and have shared collective strategies, there's actually a wide class of games where there isn't even an equilibrium. Like it's basically doomed to be chaotic. So I thought that was just a bit of a fascinating aside, right? But approval voting does change the issue or solve the Arrow's theorem problem. Basically, because instead of saying who's better than who, you're just saying which candidates am I fine with, which candidates am I not fine with. Quadratic voting is interesting in that it's like range voting in that you get to kind of score like in a very fine-grained way, well, how much do you like each candidate, right? But range voting has this problem that like if you think some candidate is good at all, then if that they're going to do an average, and let's say if the average is 55 and your actual opinion is 70, you vote 70, it might increase it to 55.01. But if you instead vote 100, then you're going to increase the average to 55.03, right? So it's just always everyone's incentive to vote either 0 or 100, and it collapses down to approval voting. But quadratic voting fixes that problem by making your votes like have a cost, right? And have a quadratic cost. So if you want to vote with a score of 1, that costs you 1 credit. If you want to vote with a score of 2, that costs 4 credits. If you want to vote with a score of 3, that has 9 credits. And so the more extreme your vote gets, the more expensive in terms of kind of sacrificing your ability to vote on all the other issues does it get to vote even like kind of 1 unit further, right? And it turns out that there's a bunch of really nice math why quadratic voting is optimal. And it does basically perfectly compensate for this kind of 0 and 100 bias that range voting has. So quadratic voting basically, it's great because it allows you to express these preferences that have varying levels of strength, where some people might be weakly against an issue, some other people might be strongly in favor of or against an issue. And it does it in this kind of more inclusive way where it's part of the protocol. Because as opposed to, like, say, for example, like NIMBYism, right, where you do have a small number of people that's like heavily against, housing being built, but the way that kind of city hall meetings and the whole system is structured work is that it basically, really selects for like a particular group of people that just have a lot of time on their hands to like actually go into these meetings and keep talking and shutting everyone down, right? So whereas with quadratic voting, it's like there is a way to express the fact that you feel something strongly or feel something weakly, but it's done in this kind of more equal way where just everyone gets some number of credits and you can just go and vote.
Right.
Yeah.